Hello class, Professor Cisneros here. This is the week 2 wrap-up. In addition to that, we're going to be touching on week 3. So in week 2, you were to evaluate sponsor CRAs model, the CRO CRA model, and the independent CRA model. And of course, as you learned, the most expensive was the sponsor, followed by the CRO, followed by the independent. So when I started in the industry in 2000, just before that was approximately the time frame that many large pharma companies were began to outsource a lot of their CRAs for many of the studies that they were doing. There was a thought process at the time. It was a trend that outsourcing was going to save every company loads and loads of money. The problem was that the CROs were just not doing, at least where I was working. The CROs just simply could not handle the amount of and number of studies that were being outsourced to them. And so as a result, there were very poor quality CRAs that were being put on these studies. And well, whenever you have poor employees monitoring, you're going to have the data is going to reflect that. So we went from everything being completely insourced back in the 90s and before to in the mid 2000s to everything being outsourced, and then a few years later it sort of ended up in the middle, which wasn't a big surprise. So a lot of large pharma companies have a stable of in-house CRAs that they use as they see fit to fill in gaps, to take on small studies, that sort of thing. And for very large studies, they have preferred vendors, preferred CROs that they use when they need a lot of CRAs that are just they're not permanent employees, and that's one of the big advantages. The last study actually that I did when I was working at a large pharma, the study was just simply too large to try to take in-house. We were in 32 countries. We had, I think it was somewhere in the vicinity of 18,000 patients. And this was a one-off. It was a phase 4, and so everything was outsourced. I mean, there were hundreds of people that were hired, and it was a lot of money. But again, it was one time, and there was just no way to be able to take that on internally. So those are the situations, that sort of flexibility the CROs give you. Now, in large CROs, large sponsor companies, large pharma, they don't typically take on independent CRAs because they typically want a lot more than the few independents that they'll be able to take on, and they want somebody to also manage them. And the contracts are also different. You can't just have a single contract, say, with a CRO. Each CRA is going to have their own contract, and a lot of companies just don't want to. They just don't want to mess with it. Now, having said that, it is a very inexpensive. It's a very inexpensive model. So you're going to have some small biotechs and other small companies embrace the independent CRAs and take, when they have small studies, they want CRAs that are going to be regional. So you can find CRAs that say live in Boston, and because you've got a couple of sites in that area, or down south, let's say in the Florida area, Texas, California, and so it becomes very advantageous for small biotech to be able to go to a resourcing company and say, I need a couple of CRAs in this region, usually within driving distance, because then you can save, that company can save a lot of money on travel expenses. Again, all of this that you saw. But it's very rare that you're going to have a situation where a project manager is going to have to present or choose from all three. Personally, I've never seen it tonight, and it's difficult to imagine a realistic scenario where that would actually be an option. But hopefully you understand where you're likely to utilize the three different models and how they interact with each other. You're also supposed to be looking at how the data helped you, and of course, different data depending on what you need. Different data is going to help you with make your decision. And then, if again, same situation, what additional data would you need? The CRO model typically has about a 30% turnover rate. The independent CRAs is pretty low. Now, one of the disadvantages is that they will often, it's rare that you'll have an independent CRA who doesn't have multiple contracts. And as I explained to a few of you about some of the disadvantages, is that because it can be sometimes contracts with sponsor companies, with small biotechs, can be very fluid. They can sign you up one day, and 2 weeks later, a month later, something happens with their funding. It's any one of 1,000 reasons they have to cut off your contract. And if they just have one contract, well, now they are they no longer have an income until they can get another contract. So most of them, to mitigate that risk, they'll have multiple contracts, at least two, sometimes more, depending on the work that's involved. So that's one of the downsides. Now, having said that, a lot of CRAs do the same thing, and so you have to look at the percentages of that. Another one of the downsides of having CRAs is that from the turnover standpoint, is that oftentimes you'll start out with very good personnel. You'll start out, say, with a couple of or a few of CRA 3s, but then when they need to be replaced, it is very often that they'll be replaced by CRA 1s. So you'll start out with a very experienced monitor and then have somebody who's brand new. Personally, I just found myself in this situation where I have a very good CRA 3 who's now being replaced with a CRA 1 who has 6 months of experience. And so you have to make there's a judgment call, and there's a number of things that you'll need to weigh as to whether or not that's going to be an acceptable change. One of the downsides of that also is you'll have to probably consult with finance, because it's very likely that you'll be paying for a CRA 3, and now the rate is going to be a lot lower for a CRA 1. So don't forget to make that adjustment where it's appropriate. Sometimes you'll have a blended rate in which that won't have any impact, but other times you'll have it won't be, and so you'll have to have a change in scope. In this case, which is rare, you'll have that reduction. So with that said, we'll go on to week 3. So in week 3, you're going to be looking at a study budget, Excel spreadsheet. Hopefully you all have some experience. Everyone has had experience working with Excel spreadsheets. They can be extremely useful, and some people are just absolute wizards, people who work with them all the time. I've been able to get away with knowing a limited amount of knowledge as it relates to formulas and calculations. It's not particularly difficult, but if you're like me, I have to be working on formulas all the time in order to retain it. There was a period of time where I had to do that, and I got to know a lot of the formulas, and then I didn't. So 5-10 years goes by, and I haven't had to do it, and now I'm back to square one. But if you have a finance person, then that's not really an issue. But knowing some basic knowledge of how to work within an Excel spreadsheet can be very useful. Don't forget, you'll have to take a look at it, and of course then add 5 additional lines, which you'll get from your readings or your personal knowledge, and feel free to add any subheadings and sub information to any of the big headings that currently exist or that you develop yourself. So with that said, good luck, and I will see you on the discussion board.